Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Future of Foraging series. I'm very excited for today. We've got two experts on human foraging to learn a bit more about insights into decision-making. So with us, we have Matthew Apps from the University of Birmingham and Aaron Bornstein from the University of California, Irvine. Myself, I'm Emma Scully, a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and with us on the panel, we have Ibo, one of the foraging committee members, and Rory as well. And we also have a guest panelist joining us today, Nora Harhan, who's a PhD student with Aaron. So just a quick overview for those of us who are joining us for the first time. We'll be doing two talks from Matthew and Aaron of 25 minutes each, and there will be a short 5-minute Q&A at the end. And after those two talks, we'll have a 20-minute roundtable discussion when we can think more about the bigger questions about this topic. So please feel free to put any questions into the Q&A throughout. After each talk, we'll answer more technical questions and then talk about kind of broader questions across both topics at the end in the roundtable. So without further ado, we'll introduce Matthew. So over to Ibo, who'll be introducing.
Hi all, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Matthew Apps here today. And we are very excited to hear his talk on human foraging. So a brief introduction. So Dr. Matthew Apps finished his PhD and postdoc at Royal Holloway, University of London. And then he moved to the University of Oxford as a postdoc first. And then he became a group leader. And he is now a BBSRC David Phillips Fellow and Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Human Brain Health, Institute for Mental Health, and School of Psychology in the University of Birmingham. And his lab is interested in the cognitive and the computational basis of motivated behavior in general, as far as I could say. I hope I'm right. And today he'll be talking about how we can apply principles that we gain from animal foraging behavior, and also the approaches. How can we apply to human foraging behavior, and how can we learn about human decision making? Thank you, Matthew. And
great.
The mic is yours.
Let me share my screen. Can people see my slides?
Yeah. All good.
Okay. Okay, great. So thank you to Ibo and everyone from the Future of Foraging for giving me the opportunity to present today. There's a lot of feedback. Can anybody hear that?
It's sounding good from my end.
Twice. Okay, I'll just have to listen to myself. Okay, so yeah, so thank you again from all the Future Foraging guys for inviting me today. So my lab is interested in psychological and neural mechanisms of motivation and social cognition. And over the last couple of years, we've started to think about some of these problems by introducing ideas for how animals forage for rewards. And so we're going to be talking today just a very high-level overview of some of the work we've been doing. And it'd be interesting to hear Aaron's talk afterwards, where I think he's going to delve more into some of the computational mechanisms that might be relevant. Okay, so we can basically make the argument that a lot of research in human decision-making over the last few decades has made a lot of progress by using very simple tasks where people have to make choices basically between two options. So a lot of that work has been using reinforcement learning tasks where you get two options, you have to learn which one is going to give you more rewards, or using decision-making tasks where you have to trade off the costs of doing something against the benefits, and you choose between different options with different costs and benefits. And these have been really powerful, really useful frameworks but they're not really the kind of problems necessarily that we always have to make in our day-to-day lives. The kind of decisions we have to make might be a bit more complex or be framed in a different way. For instance, one situation that we commonly find ourselves in is deciding how much time to spend doing one activity over another. So imagine that you're out having a coffee with a colleague during the workday. You have to decide, when do you stop that? When do you finish having that coffee with your colleague, and when do you go back to work? And so that's really a decision you have to make about how much time do I spend doing this activity, and when do I leave doing this and travel to go back to doing some alternative behavior. And to make these kind of decisions, we really have to think about what's the rewards I'm getting right now and trade that off against the value of the rewards I could be getting elsewhere. So the opportunity costs of what I'm currently doing. And that really hasn't been tackled too much in a reinforcement learning or cost-benefit decision-making framework in humans. And I can tell you as a British person that these decisions to leave are really important, and getting them wrong can have quite negative consequences. So my lab has got really interested in questions about when we choose to leave doing something. When do we stop doing one activity in favour of an alternative? And to the members of the audience who are familiar with animal foraging work will know that actually this is a problem that's been discussed and examined for many decades in terms of how animals forage for rewards. So this we can think of as a patch leaving problem. So this is something that animals have to decide all the time. They live in environments where rewards are scattered around, and they have to decide how long do they spend collecting rewards in this particular location before moving on and collecting rewards elsewhere. Now, for those in the audience who are less familiar with the patch leaving problem, I'm going to demonstrate it with this rather simplistic cartoon example of how a bee might have to think about foraging for pollen. So a bee has to collect pollen from flowers, which we can think of each flower is a patch. And what it's going to do is it's going to arrive at a flower, such as the one you can see here, and it's going to be collecting pollen. But there are some properties of the world in which it lives which shape how it should make this decision. So first is the fact that whilst it's in that flower, whilst it's in that patch collecting pollen, the more it collects, the less there is in the flower, and so the rate at which it's going to get reward over time declines. So when it first arrives in the flower, it gets lots of pollen very quickly, but the more time it spends in it, the less pollen it's collecting per unit of time. So it's got to then decide when is the right time to leave that flower and travel to another patch. So when is it going to fly and travel elsewhere? But it needs to think carefully about this decision, because although the rewards it gets in the patch are depleting, when it travels, it's getting zero reward. There's a cost, a time cost to when we travel, which is we don't get any reward at all. So to make these patch leaving decisions, we have to consider a number of variables, but I'm going to really focus on two today that are really important for the studies that we talk about. And the first is the foreground reward rate. So that is, how much reward am I getting from this particular flower if I'm the bee? So when you're getting a lot of reward, when it's a high yield flower that starts off with a lot of pollen, you're going to stay in that flower longer than if when you arrive, it's got very little pollen in it. So the foreground reward, how much reward I'm getting right now, is dictated by how much yield there is in this particular flower. But that needs to be traded off against the environment that you're in. And in particular, you can think of another reward rate is the background reward rate, which is how good are most of the flowers in the environment, or really, what is the average rate at which I get pollen from all the flowers in the environment in which I'm in. So if there's lots of the flowers have a really high yield, then you can think of it as having a high average reward rate. But if most of the flowers have very little pollen in them, then it's a very, most of them are very low yield, then it's a low average reward environment. And so these are the kind of properties that any animal has to think about when it's making these patch leaving decisions. And these ideas go back to the 1970s when Charnoff proposed marginal value theorem, where he suggested that there's a way you can calculate the optimal time to leave any given patch in any type of environment. Now, of course, in this equation, there's lots more things that we're not going to be discussing today. But the key ideas and the key take home is that to make these kind of decisions effectively, you need to compare the rate at which you're getting reward right now against the average rate of reward in the environment. And according to marginal value theorem, the optimal time to leave any patch is when that foreground reward rate falls below the average reward rate in the environment, because at that point in time, you're not going to be getting as much reward if you stay where you are compared to if you make a decision to leave. So what we got interested in my lab is how we can use these kind of patch leaving problem and these concepts to probe different facets of the psychological and neural mechanisms of human decision making. And so the first thing we did in this line of work was start to ask the question, well, first, do people conform at all to any of these principles of marginal value theorem? So to address that, we wanted to come up with an experiment where people were going to have to make patch leaving decisions. So they're going to be collecting rewards in patches, and then they'd have to decide to leave and travel to another patch to collect reward. And the setup was the following. We told participants that you are going to be acting like a farmer in a virtual game. And your goal is to collect as much milk from cows in fields as you can. And at the end of the game, the milk you've accumulated, you're going to sell to the market. And then you're going to get your bonus payment for taking part is going to be determined based on that. So these are real economic decisions that people are making in this patch leaving game. So the way the experiment worked was the following. So participants saw a series of screens that looked like this. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a patch that they entered. Now, when they entered the patch, they had to press the space bar. And when they pressed the space bar, they would start collecting milk from the cows in that field. So they had this milk pail here in gray, and they'd see it filling up with milk in white that you can see here. And all they had to do was to decide when to leave that patch by releasing the space bar. When they did that, they would see a clock that would tick down for 6 seconds until they arrived in the next patch, where they'd simply have to press and hold the space bar again, and they'd see their milk pail filling up. But what we did in this experiment was manipulate the foreground reward, which would be how quickly this was filling up, and also the background reward rate. So to manipulate the foreground rewards, what we did is we have different types of patch, which dictated the rate at which this was filling up. So the foreground rate could be one of these three that you can see here. So these curves indicate how much reward was being obtained per unit of time in the patch. So when it's high, you're seeing this fill up really rapidly, you're getting a lot of reward. When it's low, you're not getting much reward. And there were three different types of patch. So there was a high, a medium, or a low yield. And so according to marginal value theorem, you should stay longer in this type of patch than in this type of patch. But we also manipulated the background or average reward rate, or the environments that participants were in when they did this. The way we did this was that they spent blocks of 10 minutes of time in one of two different types of environment. So there was an environment which we call the poor environment, where there was a low average reward rate. And this was because 50% of the patches were low yield in this environment and 20% were high yield, which compared to the rich environment, where 20% were low yield and 50% were the high yield. So there was a lot more of these patches in the rich or good environment than there were these, and the other way around in the poor environment. So according to marginal value theorem, when you're spending these 10 minutes in each of these two different environments, you should leave all of these patches a little bit sooner in this rich environment than you should in this poor environment, because the average reward rate, the background reward rate, is higher. Okay, so firstly, we can just look at what healthy young participants do when they perform this task. So what I'm showing here is what we call the patch leaving time, or the mean leaving time. So this is how long people spent collecting rewards on average in different types of patch in different environments. And in the x-axis, I'm showing the different types of yields, so high yield to low yield. And in the different colors, the gold is the rich environment and the green is the poor environment. And so what you can see here is people spent longer in high yield patches than low yield patches, in line with marginal value theorem, but also what you can see is people spend less time in each of these types of patch in the rich environment than they did in the poor environment. So consistent with the idea that when you have higher background or average reward rates, you leave all of these types of patch sooner. So that fits with this idea that you can take from marginal value theorem that people are leaving when they're computing the comparison between the foreground reward rate and the average reward rate. I will say, and I think Aaron's going to come to this in his talk, that people were over harvesting. So the people's leaving times were much later than what they should be according to a marginal value theorem optimal. And I think Aaron's going to talk about the mechanisms that might explain that. But beyond that, we can say in terms of principles, people were staying longer in high yield patches and people were leaving sooner in rich environments, which is consistent with what MVT predicts in terms of the direction of effects. So based on the fact that we know that we can get consistent behavior that fits with those principles, we then wanted to ask, well, what neuromodulator might be important for driving these patch leaving decisions in humans? And the idea we had came from this work from a few years ago from Yale Niven colleagues, who suggested that the tonic background firing of dopamine neurons isn't passive, it actually reflects the average reward rate or the opportunity costs in an environment. And so you can follow on from that work the idea that if tonic dopamine also reflects average reward rate, then it might do something in terms of our patch leaving behavior. Specifically, what it suggests is that if the average reward rate, if tonic dopamine increases, then it is related to an increase in the average reward rate in an environment, and that shifts around the costs and benefits of leaving. So you actually perceive that the average value out there in the world is higher, and therefore you should spend less time in each patch. So basically going back to this, the concept in this graph, that as tonic dopamine increases, it should therefore represent an increase in the average reward rate of the environment and therefore earlier times to leave in a patch. So to test those ideas, we performed a neuropsychopharmacology study. So we got healthy participants to come into the lab and did a double-blind crossover design. So in one session, participants came in and they took a placebo pill. In the other, they took cabergoline, which is a dopamine agonist, a D2 receptor agonist. And we got them in both sessions to perform exactly the same task that you've already seen. So 10-minute periods in two different environments and low, medium, and high yield patches. And what I'm showing here is the average leaving times across those different conditions. So again, in the goldy color is when they're in the rich environment, in the green color is when they're in the poor environment. But here, solid lines represent when they were on cabergoline, and the dotted lines represent when they were in the placebo condition. Now, in all conditions, people left later from the high yield patches than the low yield patches, as you'd expect. And in both on and off drug, there was an environment effect. So people left sooner when in the rich environment than in the poor environment. But we found a drug state by average reward rate or environment interaction. So what you can see is that there's no difference in the rich environment, whether they were on or off drug. But when they were in the poor environment, you can see that there's earlier leaving times when they were on the cabergoline versus when they were on the placebo. And that's across all three patches. So that reflects the idea that people were leaving earlier in the poor environment when they were on cabergoline versus when they're in the placebo. And just to state, there was also no effect of dopaminergic medication on leaving time variability on a variety of other metrics. So all of this was consistent with the idea that when people are there, we have an increase in the efficacy of the dopamine system, particularly dopamine D2 receptor activity at dopamine D2 receptors. You basically increase how the environment's perceived average reward rate, such that people believe that that the reward rate is slightly higher, and therefore they're leaving patches sooner. Okay, so that's sort of one example of the kind of work that we've been doing, and I think lots of Aaron's work will touch on a lot of that, those ideas as well. But another question we're really interested in my lab is just how pro-social people are, how willing people are to do behaviours that result in rewards for other people compared to how willing they are to do the same behaviours to obtain rewards for themselves. And this is a question that has typically been looked at using reinforcement learning paradigms in the past, or cost-benefit decision-making paradigms. And what you always tend to find is that people are more incentivized by getting rewards for themselves than they are for completely anonymous other individuals. So people learn faster to obtain rewards for themselves, and people are more willing to put in higher amounts of effort for themselves compared to get rewards for other people. And so that's really interesting in terms of understanding human prosocial behavior. But what about when it comes to foraging? So the nice thing about the foraging frameworks, as we've already discussed, is that it breaks down it into these two different reward rates. There's the foreground reward rate, how much reward I'm getting right now, and the average or background reward rate. And so what we don't know, or we didn't know before this, is whether people are more incentivized by their own rewards, and therefore whether that translates into an increase in foreground reward sensitivity, or whether it might be that there's a change in how people perceive the average rate of rewards for themselves or for others. So we wanted to do a paradigm where we could test, using this foraging framework, whether people might have a difference in sensitivity to different types of reward rate for self or for when being prosocial. So how can we do that? Well, we did an experiment that was very, very similar to the one that you've seen previously. So participants are foraging for rewards here. Again, they're seeing, in this case, a bucket fill up with berries rather than milk, but the setup for this experiment is otherwise almost exactly the same. So they see this bucket filling up, they hold the space bar in order to do that. When they release it, they see a clock ticking down until they get into the next patch. But in half the blocks, they were doing this foraging in order to increase their own bonus payment. But in the other half of the blocks, they were doing it to increase the bonus payment of a completely anonymous other individual. So they knew no other information about this person, apart from the fact that they were in a neighboring testing room. And we went through a whole procedure where they wave either side of a door silently in rubber gloves in order to make sure that it's fully anonymous, but there really is another participant there. But there's no element of reputation that could drive changes in behavior here, because they knew they would never meet this other individual, and there's no reciprocity. So they know that they, as the participant, are the only one who's making decisions about rewards in this experiment. So otherwise, the setup was very, very similar to what you've seen previously. The only difference was there was only two types of patch here. So there was a high yield patch and a low yield patch. And again, there was two different types of environments. So there was a rich environment with lots of high yield patches, or a poor environment with lots of low yield patches. So again, what I'm going to plot here is just the average leaving times across the different conditions. And what you can see here on the x-axis is the high versus the low yield patches. In red is trials where they're foraging for themselves. In blue is decisions when they're foraging for the other person. And the lighter colored lines here are the rich environment, and the darker are the poor environment. And what you can see, consistent with the previous experiment, is people are staying longer in high yield patches than low yield patches. They are leaving sooner in the rich environment than in the poor environment. But what we did find was a beneficiary, self versus other, by patch type interaction. And so that is reflected in the fact that these blue lines here for the other are shallower than the red lines for self. So when it came to people's foraging for in low yield patches, there was no significant difference in terms of their leaving times between self and other. But when it was in the high yield patches, there was a significant difference with lower leaving times in both types of environment for other compared to self. So another way of thinking of this is there's a bigger difference in people's changes in their leaving times between a high and a low yield patch for self than there is for other. And so that tells us, on top of that, just to say that there was no significant beneficiary by environment or background reward rate effect. So what does that mean? It means that people were not changing their behavior differently in the different environments between self and other, but they were showing less sensitivity to high yield rewards for other people compared to themselves. And so that there's much more in this preprint if you're interested, but that tells us the way that we can start to ask questions about human prosocial behavior by turning to these foraging frameworks to give us something extra about understanding how people are less sensitive to others' rewards. So the last area of our research that I wanted to just touch upon is this work that we did a few years ago to look at a different kind of question about when we leave. And that is, how do we make decisions about when to leave social interactions? So decades of research has used economic games to look at this idea that people are sensitive to fairness. So in economic games, you find that people are irrational. We will punish other people for behaving unfairly, even if it means a significant cost to ourselves, because we would rather somebody else didn't profit when from unfair behavior. Now, these have been really important work, and it's really well established that people are really sensitive to the fairness of other people's behaviors. But in the real world, we can't always punish other people. Sometimes we might simply make a decision to stop interacting with that person and go and find somebody else to interact with. And so we wondered whether we might actually be able to examine whether how people make these decisions of when to leave social interactions and apply some of the principles of marginal value theorem to how people represent the fairness of other people. And if we apply MVT-like principles to how people make these decisions of when to leave others, you actually get an interesting possibility, which is rather than people maximizing reward, what they try and do is maximize a trade-off between reward and fairness. And when doing that, that means that people might spend less time with unfair people, which is not exactly surprising. We don't want to spend lots of time with people who don't treat us very fairly. But if you're in an environment where lots of people are very fair, a generous environment, you might actually spend less time interacting with each individual, in line with that idea that higher average rewards, in this case, higher average fairness, mean that there's a bigger opportunity cost to leave each person. So we wanted to test those ideas using a patch leaving type experiment, but here the patches are people. So you are engaged in a game where what you do is you connect with another player, and what you're going to see is repeated offers from that other person of how they want to divide a pot of money. So you see this bar here. The width of this pot, the bar tells you the size of the pot, so the amount of money that was on offer. The green side tells you how much the other person's offering you, and the purple side, how much the other person's keeping, and the purple side tells you how much you're being offered to keep by the other person. Now you're going to be connected, and every couple of seconds you're just going to see more and more offers from that other person. And all you do as a participant is decide when to leave. So unlike other economic games, you can't do anything about these offers, you can't punish this other person, you can't respond to this other person, you just have to make a decision of when to leave. Now, crucially, when you leave, you have to spend 8 seconds until you're connected with another player. So economically, it makes little sense to ever leave, because if you leave, you're going to get none of this money, and therefore you're going to end up losing out. But if you care about fairness of these offers, you might respond to and make a decision to leave in order to connect with another player. So the way this game worked is that we manipulated the offers that you saw from the other person to make it a bit like a patch leaving experiment. So when you entered into the patch, you got pretty fair offers from the players, but over time, the fairness of the offers decayed. So this is the percentage that the other person's offering you over offers. But we had different types of other player you could be connected with. So we had fairer players or more generous players, where the decay rate was lower than when you were connected to a less fair player. So this person's going to start offering you lower proportions more rapidly than this person. So we had different types of player, so we could look at whether people might be sensitive to the foreground fairness of the person that you're connected to, the offers you're connected to. But we also could have background generosity or background fairness, which is we created 5-minute environments that participants entered into for 5 minutes, where the majority of players were either more generous or the majority of players were less generous. So they had a majority with a low decay rate or a majority with a high decay rate. Now, we also manipulated the size of the pots that participants got in this, such that over time, the average reward you got was always the same if you remain connected to the player. So basically, every few offers, we made the size of the bar increased, the size of the total pot increased, such that over time, it was always the best thing to do in terms of maximizing reward to stay connected to a player. So what we can then do, again, is look at the leaving times average leaving times in this task. And if marginal value theorem could apply to fairness, then we might expect that people will leave sooner from unfair players than fair players, and people might leave sooner when there's a low average fairness compared to when there's a high average fairness compared to low average fairness. And across repeated experiments now, we've shown exactly that. So here I'm showing the mean leaving time across 2 different versions of the experiment. And you can see that people stay connected to more generous, to fair players longer than they stay connected to unfair players. But there's also a significant effect of the environment. So people spend less time connected to players in the more generous environment compared to in the lower generosity environment. And that's been shown in repeated experiments now. So we can maybe therefore think that we do treat people a little bit like patches. So we stay longer connected to fairer players, but we also spend less time interacting with people when in environments where most people are going to treat us fairly. Okay, so that's just a very sort of snapshot overview of the kind of experiments we've been using, where we take foraging principles and we try and apply them to different types of human decision-making problem. By using that kind of approach, we've shown that dopamine has a role in processing potentially the average rate of reward in the environment, and that when you boost levels of dopamine, you might make people perceive the average reward rate in the environment as higher, and therefore makes you leave patches sooner. We can ask questions about pro-social behavior using these kind of tasks, showing that we are actually less sensitive only to the foreground rewards and not to the average rewards when we're collecting rewards for other people. And we can also use this kind of approach and see whether other types of reward, in this case, how fairness influences how long we spend interacting with other people. Okay, so just to mention that this has been very much a sort of snapshot overview, but also that we're taking this work a bit further by using computational approaches. So part of this grant with Mark Humphreys, Nathan Lepora, we're extending the work that Emma's actually done in her PhD to build a whole battery of different computational models that can explain all of these kind of patch-leading problems that we'd hope that will be useful to the kind of community that's part of the Future of Foraging network. So just a big thank you to all of the people involved in this research, particularly to Campbell, who led the dopamine work, Sebastian, who led the pro-social work, and Anthony, who led the work on the foraging for fairness. And thank you very much for listening.
So great talk, impressive work. So there's one question in the Q&A box. So from Rory, really interesting talk. So do you give real world rewards for the players for success in the foraging game, or are they purely virtual?
So do you mean by real? Do you mean in terms of whether rewards real economic rewards?
I guess so. Real world rewards. I think money, or I don't know, food. I don't know what it is.
I mean, so we haven't done it with food. Obviously, that's much easier in animal work than it is with humans. So what we do in the experiment is people get a base payment for coming in to do the experiment, like an hourly rate, but they also get told in advance there's this amount of total bonus payment you can get. So I can't remember the exact numbers for that particular version of the experiment. And then the amount of milk that they collect literally affects how much of that bonus payment they get. So the better people are at the task, the more rewards they actually get. But it's economic rather than primary.
Okay. I have a question as well. For pro-social behavior, you see that the foreground reward is affected. How they treat that is affected, but not the background reward. So, but do you also know how dopamine affects this decision? So the theory suggests that the average dopamine levels should reflect the background. So, and then like a very linear logic, so it shouldn't affect the pro-social reward selection, right? So
we haven't done that work, and I guess in the literature it's a bit confusing in terms of a mixed picture about what dopamine does for these kinds of pro-social versus self-benefiting choices. So there's some work out there that suggests that in very simple words, if you boost dopamine levels, you make people more selfish. So you make people prioritize their own rewards over getting rewards for another person. But I don't know, in this sense, it doesn't necessarily make a strong prediction about what you'd expect in my experiment, because obviously if we're saying that dopamine has a role in average rewards and not in foreground rewards, then it's unclear why that would then change behavior in the pro-social task. So we'd have to do the work basically to know the answer to your question.
So can you speculate what kind of modulation might be important for prosocial behaviors or choices?
Yeah, I mean, it's likely. I mean, these social decisions obviously probably involve a wide range of neuromodulators rather than just one, and I don't think just dopamine is involved in these foraging choices either when it's for selves. So I think it's likely that you might find things like oxytocin, etc., are important. We know that oxytocin modulations can also manipulate responsive dopamine neurons in some work. So it's potentially a mechanism by which other neuromodulators then change the dopamine system in order to drive these pro-social choices. But I think it's probably quite a complex system that actually drives them.
And I have one more question about the methodology for the fairness experiments. Do you do a questionnaire to the participants about how they feel before they start the experiment? I mean, a grumpy person might be more likely to punish the other part, or or leave, right? Let's say this time it's not punishment, but leave.
Yeah, so what we actually thought is that it might be more linked to sort of trait levels of mood disorders. So we actually collected scores on a depression questionnaire and a loneliness questionnaire. And that was quite interesting because it showed an interaction between those questionnaire scores and people's behavior in the tasks. So basically, people who had higher levels of this kind of like trait loneliness would react much worse to getting an unfair player in a fair environment. In an unfair environment. So they'd almost react worse than they should, right? So they ended up spending less time collecting rewards and skipping on from players more quickly than they actually should, because even though a player was treating them a bit unfairly in an unfair environment, the next one's going to treat you unfairly anyway. So if you keep missing out on people, then you're going to end up not getting very rewarded. And so that was the sort of interaction we found there. So we think, I mean, we just need to do a lot more work really to uncouple what the mechanism of that might be. But it certainly is interesting that things like trait levels of loneliness might be influenced by how you then spend time interacting with people.
Thank you. One more question from Rory. So interesting. Thanks for the answer. As a follow-up, have you or others also experimented with incorporating real-world cost into human foraging tasks? Would be interesting to wonder if the decision-making dynamics would be altered in the context of cost and not just rewards.
So we have done some work. It's not published, but we did some work looking at effort costs. So people had to squeeze a grip force device in order to travel. So the equivalent being to get to the next patch being climbing a mountain versus climbing a small fence. And we found what you would kind of expect from traditional foraging work, which is the idea that more effort effectively means that the travel cost is higher. So people spent longer in patches if the travel cost was higher compared to if it was lower. Obviously, we don't quite have it like they do in the nice animal work where we can calculate the amount of joules of energy expended, etc. But we can say that it's probably a nice parallel is to look at this. And actually, that's what Emma's doing in a lot of her PhD, is looking at effort in these foraging tasks.
Great.
No spoilers.
Thank you. So, I mean, those are the questions so far.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Matt. It's a very interesting talk. So now we'll move over to Aaron, who will hopefully tell us a little bit more about the kind of modelling that you can do behind these kinds of foraging tasks. So I will kick you off, but you can come back later. Thanks, Matt. And let me invite Aaron on the screen. Great. Hi, Aaron. So if you want to start sharing your slides, and in the meantime, I can introduce you. So Aaron completed his PhD in cognitive neuroscience at NYU in 2007, where he was looking at the role of the hippocampus and the striatum in model-based learning. He continued his research as a postdoc at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, and in 2019, he became assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine, where he leads the computational cognitive neuroscience lab. So Aaron is interested in how memory is involved in decision-making and planning. And his lab uses computational models to understand human behavior and brain activity. And I believe that today we're going to hear a bit more about how these models are applied to human foraging. So over to you, Aaron, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Matthew, for an excellent talk, and we'll do my very best not to let everyone down after following that. So I want to say I really appreciate this invitation, in large part because this is my lab's very first foray into foraging, and we are very aware of sort of the vast space of things that we do not know, and which we are deeply keen to learn from this group. So I'm very excited to have this opportunity. In fact, the talk is going to close with some preliminary data and some requests for insight and experiences from people who have worked on these kinds of tasks before, because we've found some things that we want to figure out how to study properly. Okay, so as Matthew mentioned, my work kind of focuses on the computational mechanisms. And in particular, this work, which is done by Nora Haran, who's going to be on the panel later, focuses on the computational mechanisms behind this persistent observation of overharvesting. Okay, but I'm going to frame it sort of within the larger project within my lab, which is to sort of understand why it is that it's sort of commonly accepted knowledge that people are really bad at making decisions, and in particular, decisions under uncertainty. Right? This is reached the level of folk knowledge where there are all these popular science books about how bad we are and about how we need to fix these buggy humans. And I think that this notion really deserves a critical examination of the notions of optimality and adaptiveness. And I'm certainly not the only person who thinks this, right? Other people have thought this and written very good books about it, and I highly recommend those. And sort of the general premise of my lab, the working hypothesis of my lab and many others, is that the point here is that we should just stop measuring people against external, naively objective measures of optimality, and instead account for their experiences when we try to rationalize their behavior. And that's basically the entire talk. You can go away, make breakfast or whatever it is that you want to do right now, and come back in 20 minutes for the conversation if you like. But if you'd like to stick around, I can sort of illustrate a little bit more deeply what it is that we're doing. So I'll start from a line of work focusing on these standard measures of decision characteristics, which has become big business, right? So people have been using this for identifying decision traits that allow them to make guidance for individuals in things like financial portfolio allocation. Okay, that makes some sense, right? Some clinical decisions, including about things like when predicting when someone might relapse in substance use disorder, and that starts to get pretty serious. And even aid workers have been using this to design incentive structures for things like polio vaccine distribution. And in these cases, you really, really, really don't want to false alarm, right? Like you want to be really sure that you're doing this right. And so one person in my lab, Nidhi Banavar, is a fifth year, worked on this and really. So Nidhi's from New Jersey, so she has a deeply ingrained skepticism of many things in this world, and she also has a statistics degree, and so she likes to apply that rigor to her skepticism. And so what we did is we looked at many of these standard decision-making instruments, and we asked, are they really measuring stable traits, or are they influenced by context and a particular form of context, right? So we're going to look at several standard measures, which classify individuals as ambiguity or risk-seeking or risk-averse, or ambiguity-seeking or ambiguity-tolerant, or patient or impulsive. And they do so by estimating these single parameters, right? Risk coefficient, ambiguity coefficient, and this discount factor. And they have these standard features to them, right? They are randomized trials, right? Every trial is shuffled. So you're not, you're getting a completely different choice set each time you run the task, and they're also incentive compatible, right? So you're not only telling the people to treat each decision independently and as if it were the only one that counts, but you actually pay people based on only one or two randomly selected choices. And so it really is the case that, each one counts the same and should be treated independently. Okay. But do people actually treat them independently? That's an assumption. And we're going to suggest that maybe these tasks, which are, ostensibly decisions from description tasks, are actually in some sense also decisions from experience. And that will lead us into the discussion of foraging. So Nidhi came up with a really clever way to measure the influence of trial sequence. So what she did is she broke down these trials into pairs based on their objective properties, right? So, like the amount of value, delay, risk, or ambiguity from one trial to the next. So, it could go up, it could go down, and we could bin trials based on whether these difference between them, increased or decreased between successive trials. And then she designed a hierarchical Bayesian model, which included these sort of spillover terms on the choice process. So you could measure the degree to which the previous choice influenced the next choice based on which kind of trial sequence you were observing, right? And then actually influence different aspects of the choice process independently, okay? And we used some previously collected data in a standard intertemporal choice task and a standard risk-seeking task. And then we also designed a new experiment based on this sort of standard ambiguity tolerance task. And the key point in the new experiment, I just want to mention, is that we fixed the sequences such that there's no microstructure to them, right? So there's no sort of like runs of moving up or down in ambiguity tolerance. And that's going to be important for the results that we show. We wanted to sort of like remove the opportunity for adaptation at the microstructural, at the individual trial context level. Okay. So then we can ask the question, does this spillover affect choices? We can look at the estimated values of the spillover parameters. And I'm going to collapse all the different choice model across all the different choice model components here in the interest of time. But the point here is that, in most sequences, at least one component of choice was affected primarily, and the largest effect sizes are actually on the drift rate components. We use the evidence accumulation model, suggesting that it's consistent with the idea that it's really about the choice computation about itself, about the value estimation process itself, not simply some form of like motor or perceptual adaptation, right? This was also true in the ambiguity tolerance task when value went up and down. But remember, I mentioned that we designed the microstructure such that the ambiguity itself was not did not experience any runs, and that actually more or less abolished sequential effects in almost all of the ambiguity sequences, right? Suggesting that we really did sort of get rid of this ambiguity effect. So how does this actually affect people's inferences about decision traits? There are meaningful quantitative changes, right? So here I'm plotting the risk factor, the risk coefficient and the ambiguity coefficient across all of the subjects, and these are in log scale, right? So these are just huge changes, and they span the spectrum. Sometimes they get smaller, sometimes they get larger. And so what we're able to see here is that, accounting for these effects really does meaningfully change the coefficients that come out, and not just quantitatively, but also qualitatively. So what you're looking at here is re-simulating the choices using the choice models, including the spillover terms. And we can see that the fraction of simulations where the interpretation of the outcome actually changes, and it's just nearly all of them in the ambiguity tolerance task, and as well, or in the ambiguity tolerance challenge task for the ambiguity term and for the risk term, right? So then this is because we allowed for there to be runs in the value as well. So it really suggests that people should be accounting for this in their use of these in their use of these decision instruments. And so the takeaway from this that I want to highlight, for the purposes of moving on to the foraging discussion, is that it may be the case that people are just sort of mechanistically inclined to treat tasks as sequential, right? So if I ask you two consecutive choices in an intertemporal choice task, and in the first one I ask you to choose between $5 today and $10 in 22 days, and you think, well, maybe I'll use the $5 today to buy some French fries, or I'll the $10 in 22 days to buy a cheeseburger or something like that. If I ask you on the very next trial something very, very similar, $5 today versus $10 in 35 days or something like that, you're not going to start from zero. You're not going to completely recompute your calculation here. You're not going to completely reimagine the scenarios. You may end up just being a bit faster to decide the second decision because you're reusing the computation from previous, right? And so, this suggests that this is one interpretation that suggests that people do sort of inherently treat the world as sequential. And I think that's very natural for those of us, those of you who work on foraging more broadly, right? So, one approach is to account for these sequential effects using this more complicated version of the model. And another approach is to switch to these more ecologically valid tasks, right? And luckily, Matthew gave an outstanding introduction to this concept, so I can just kind of breeze through some of the main ideas, because we're talking about really the same kinds of tasks. But I think everyone here is familiar with the idea that it is often observed and has been suggested that two alternative force choice is just kind of weird to animals in the natural environment or even in cages. And really what they're doing is more this sort of serial evaluation, where they if this gorilla will smell this particular object that is trying to decide whether or not to eat, and then either put it down or eat it and then move on to the next one, right? And so that is the sort of thing that's captured in these kinds of serial patch leaving tasks that Matthew described earlier, right? Where you're sort of thinking about what it is that you have experienced recently, and then using that to decide whether to keep eating at this particular bush or particular patch, and then move on to the next or not. Right, so you can stay or so you can leave. And as Matthew also said, there's a well-known optimal policy for this sort of task, the marginal value theorem, where if the quality of the local patch, the instantaneous quality of the local patch, falls beneath what you estimate to be the average quality of the global patch, then you decide to leave. And I will just bring up that people tend to follow this marginal value theorem roughly qualitatively, but humans, animals of all kinds consistently exhibit over-harvesting. They stay just a bit longer than the marginal value theorem will prescribe. And there's all kinds of explanations for this. And Alex Koselnik, I think in the very first presentation in this series, pointed out, I think quite emphatically, that MVT was always meant to be a dynamic optimum, right? But it's often applied statically. And so I think that one of the ways you can view the work that we're going to discuss here today is that we're accounting for these dynamics. And by dynamics, I mean between trial dynamics, not the sort of within trial dynamics that you saw from Ahmed El-Hadi last season. Okay, so this begins from an insight that a lot of people have had, which is that this optimum, this global average optimum, is being learned, right? And you're constantly learning it from your experience, and you're constantly using it to estimate what your future experience might be. Okay, several people have taken this idea. I've been involved in some of this work and applied it to trying to understand learning different aspects of the patch leaving task in rodents and monkeys and in humans. And it's led to several different and honestly somewhat incompatible explanations. But Nora's insight was that in the real world, and we saw this actually reflected in Matthew's tasks as well, that there's actually sort of like heterogeneous structure to the environment, right? It's not simply the case that you're just sampling from a patch that is of the same independent, identically distributed type as the rest of the patches in the environment. Instead, what you're doing is you're sampling from patches that have different amounts of richness. And so what you really should be doing is you should be learning that there is this sort of multimodal structure, and you should be using that to sort of guide your choices as you move forward through the environment. Decide whether I'm in a rich patch now or a poor patch, and use that to decide whether or not you want to stay or leave, and adjust your optimum as a result of that, right? Okay, so in this way, it's really a structure learning problem, and we can sort of understand, well, maybe the optimum might be uncovered by appealing to optimal learning theory. Okay, so we built a task that has this kind of structure to it, or rather Nora did, and it builds on previous work by Sarah Constantino and also by Hugo Decker and Kate Hartley. Evaluating these kinds of tasks in a space environment, right? So this is very exciting for people of all ages, which is part of the reason that we did it. So what happens here is you go to a planet, the alien welcomes you, says, "Hey, mine our planet, go for it." You dig, you get some gems, and then you get less with each dig, and eventually you have to decide whether you stick around or move on. And I note that there's a fixed travel time in this version of the task, right? So we're not manipulating travel time at all. All we're manipulating is the relative richness of the different planets, right? So this is an important deviation from Sarah's original task. and also from a lot of the tasks that are usually used in the study of humans, right? Some of these planets are richer, right? So their value will diminish more slowly as the planet is mined, and others are poorer and they'll diminish at a faster rate. And as I hinted at earlier, there is a well-known sort of optimal solution for learning in this kind of environment that comes from category learning. The idea is to have a non-parametric prior, where if you're a Bayesian learner, you can treat this distribution learning as a problem where there's just a number of clusters in the environment and you don't know how many it is. And this has been applied very widely in human decision-making and category learning for quite some time now. It's known as the infinite capacity mixture model or latent cause model. And so Nora really did the work of applying it to the foraging environment. So at each trial, then, you're asking not just, should I stay or should I go? But you're also asking, what type of planet is this? You're doing some sort of online inference of what you've experienced, what you're currently experiencing. And you're trying to decide how to assign the current planet to this structure, right? And we can tell people if there is this structure. They can sort of infer it across their many experiences across these planets. And we allowed for people to vary in their prior expectation about how many clusters there might be in the environment. Again, we didn't tell them there were multiple clusters in the environment, but people might have a different predilection towards assuming that environments have more or less structure in them. Okay, and we let this be an individual difference variable. Okay, so we captured it as this environmental complexity prior, which suggests how inclined people are to assume that there might be multimodal structure in the environment, and therefore how many clusters they might group these planets into. This also allowed for a second parameter, which is how sensitive their discounting of the future potential rewards is to their uncertainty about the environmental complexity. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about this in the next couple of slides. But also unbeknownst to the individuals performing the task is that there was a transition structure where if you were in a particular planet type, then there's an 80% chance that you're going to switch back to that planet type on the next trial, and a 10% chance that you'll switch to either of the other two planet types, right? And so we assume that people are sort of learning this transition structure at the same time that they're learning the structure of the environment, okay? And we allow them to vary in the degree to which they assume the environment complexity, and also the degree to which they use that environment complexity to discount what might be happening in the future. So people with high alpha might be inclined to think that there's lots of clusters. People with low alpha might be inclined to group everything together as though it were one single Gaussian distribution of planets. And people with high alpha would generate more accurate predictions in this task. So they would have a higher probability of inferring the correct patch type on any given trial, whereas people with low alpha would sort of smear everything together and get kind of like a grand mean across all of them. Okay? And so, to explain a little bit more about the value of this discount factor, or this uncertainty sensitive discount factor, learning the structure really allows you to know what you don't know, right? So, and this builds on some work from computational reinforcement learning, which says that your uncertainty about your world model should dictate your planning horizon. If I am not as confident in my understanding of this transition structure and state structure of the world, I shouldn't plan that far ahead in it, right? I should plan a little bit shorter. And this has been shown formally by Satinder Singh and colleagues previously. So we, linearized it. We made a linear approximation to this, and we allowed people to differ in how much they're affected by their uncertainty about the world model, and then use that to discount what their expectations were of future rewards after leaving the patch, right? So that would affect their estimation of the global optimum. And these two variables, alpha and the gamma coefficient, independently and interactively altered performance on the task. So this is in simulation running through the task. And this is a sort of plot that you're going to see a few more times over the next several slides, where we measure their PRT, their planet residence time, relative to the predictions of what marginal value theorem would be, assuming that it knew the global average, right? So just taking a mean across all planet types. Okay. So, you might say this sort of static MVT is a straw man. I agree. So we have a couple of different comparisons. One is looking at the planet residence time relative to the marginal value theorem for both this adaptive discounting with structured learning model. So here in yellow, and here the upper arrows is better, so sort of more over harvesting. Also for a temporal difference learning model. So this is built on like Sarah Constantino's model from that 2015 paper, and also a learning version of the MDT model, which learns a unimodal distribution of rewards. And learns it trial by trial. So we're not sort of just comparing against the MBT strawman. Okay, and then again, across the entirety of the task, on average, the adaptive discounting model gives us a more consistent overharvesting and also a more sensible pattern of overharvesting, right? So you overharvest a bit more on rich planets than you do on poor planets, for instance, and that is not this kind of pattern that we see either in TD or in the adaptive discounting model. And finally, this is a better explanation of behavior, right? So here, lower is better. This is cross-validation score. Nora fit the model to 9/10 of the trials, and then tested its ability to predict the choices that the subjects made on the held-out 10th, and then summed across all of those folds. And the adaptive discounting model had less error than either TD or the MVT learning model. So it was a good fit to people across the population, and also to each individual person individually, except for a few people here at the end. So, it suggests that what we're doing is really sort of capturing people's choices and their on different trial types better than the alternative models. Okay. So, I started today with a plea to be deeply skeptical of individual difference measures, especially ones that posit some people to be more correct than another. And now I've just given you two new individual difference measures. So you should be deeply skeptical of me for saying this. And so I should have to, convince you that these are, potentially useful individual difference measures. And so there's a couple of different ways to do that. One is we can examine how well they predict performance in a model-free sense on subsets of the data, right? So here we're going to look at the switch points, which by definition are about 20% of the data. And the idea here is that if people are more uncertain about their state representation after switches, then they should be more likely to overharvest, right? And that does appear to be the case, right? Their planet residence time after the switch is greater than their planet residence time after the no switch relative to MVT, okay? And this seems to correlate with their uncertainty adaptation coefficient, suggesting that there's some meaning to this parameter. It is also the case, an even stronger test, in fact, that we can test the validity of these parameters on data that the model wasn't fit to at all. So this was just fit to choices, not to RTs, though the RTs are informative in this task, as we'll see. And here again, the idea is that your relative response time should be faster, slower on this after a switch trial than after a no switch trial. And that this should correlate with your environment complexity prior. So how likely you are to divide the world up into separate clusters. So the more likely you are to divide the world up into separate clusters, the more likely you are to slow down after you switch into a new cluster. Okay. So that's hopefully these are some of these individual difference parameters. We have some ongoing work which will, hopefully validate this a little bit more. So one is looking at development. So Nora, in collaboration with Kate Hartley at NYU, whose work I mentioned earlier, is evaluating this task in children and adolescents. And the premise here is that children have been thought to see the world as being more simply structured than adults. And they're also less likely to, even if they do infer the environment structure, less likely to use that to inform their decisions. And this makes sense because the sort of neural regions implicated in structure learning, like the anterior prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex, develop into young adulthood, right? And so the idea here is that we would predict that younger children and maybe even adolescents would be less likely to infer the sort of multimodal structure. As of the last data, this is still ongoing, but as of the last data that was sent to me, this is the case. When we look at grouping children and adolescents versus the adults have a higher values of the structure learning parameter on average than do the children and the adolescents. And also within the children and adolescents, the structure learning parameter does correlate with their switch minus no switch response. Their age does correlate with their switch minus no switch response time, suggesting that there is something going on here in terms of structure learning ability changing with age. within this task. Again, this is work in progress. We're going to collect a bunch more subjects soon, and hope this holds up. Okay, so those are the takeaways. I have one more preliminary result to show you towards the end, but I'll just sort of summarize everything that we've seen so far, which is the suggestion here is that overharvesting may partly be explained by people looking at this. It's just learning and planning underlying mechanisms that are driving these kinds of decisions. In particular, structure learning, and a prior for the expectation that the environment is going to have multiple modes in it, and optimal look ahead, right? So adjusting for internal uncertainty about that structure of the environment. It suggests that individual variation can be rationalized by experience both within the environment and also across the lifespan, right? So, we showed that the structure learning parameter may change as people grow into adulthood and learn to expect more complex environments. And this also raises a question, which is, if people had experiences, in particular early experiences with more unpredictable environments, might they have greater uncertainty adaptive discounting? Okay, and so we do have some preliminary evidence that this is the case, and this is what I really want to get people's thoughts on, because this is very much still in progress. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at individual differences in this uncertainty adaptation parameter as a function of unpredictability in the early life environment. And we're going to measure that retrospectively using this survey measure called the QUIC, the Questionnaire for Unpredictability in Childhood, which was developed by some collaborators of ours at the Conti Center at UCI and Chapman University, in particular Laura Glynn and Alicia Davis. And what they've done is created this sort of retrospective measure of unpredictability in the childhood environment that uses these very simple questions like asking about your morning routine prior to age 12 and so on and so forth. What is amazing is that this questionnaire predicts symptoms, mental health outcomes and symptoms well into adulthood. And this has been shown many, many times. And it has been linked also to work in rodents, which I'm going to bring up in a second, suggesting that early life unpredictability in rodents and early life unpredictability in humans predict similar kinds of outcomes and similar kinds of phenotypes, as much as we can draw parallels between these species. And so the hypothesis that comes from this is that an unpredictable childhood might mean that you're less likely to plan ahead through uncertain environments, right? You might have a higher expectation of that uncertainty, and that might, adapt your planning a bit more dramatically. And that is, in fact, what we observe in the data from the task that I showed you earlier. This is just the adult data that I presented in the published task. But we didn't publish this part because we're going to follow up on this for a couple of reasons, which I'll explain now. So, first of all, there's enormous amounts of variability here, right? I mean, this is a retrospective measure. It's rather remarkable that it predicts, performance in this task among people who are in their 30s on average. But also, there are some subtleties to this, right? And one is that if we split up these individuals by their self-reported gender, we find that the effect is carried basically entirely by people who identify as male. And this is consistent with a lot of work that has been shown in rodents, where the males express a wider variety of decision-making phenotypes relative to mental health outcomes. And so the request here is for the people who are in this audience who have worked with this kind of task before. Do you see in rodents, in primates, non-human primates, do you see sex differences that may be related to this work? I know there's a recent finding from Andy Wickenheiser's group at UCLA using, again, a multimodal structured version of this task, where they find things that could be concordant with this. It may be completely different mechanisms in humans. Obviously, self-reported gender doesn't quite map onto the sex determination in rodents. I'm very, very interested to hear people's thoughts on this. We want to trudge ahead cautiously, but we want to understand really what's going on here. So that's that. I just want to thank the people who did the work that I presented today, and Nidhi Banavar and Nora Haran, who you're going to hear from in a bit. And thank the people who pay to put the lights on, and I am happy to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Aaron. That was really fascinating and cool to see all this kind of new stuff coming through in terms of like the development and the QUIC and everything like that. Really cool. We don't have any questions yet in the Q&A, but I do have a question, if that's okay. So I'm interested in, obviously you're talking about like the environment in terms of the, like how clustered it is and the different patch types. But I was thinking about also if the environment is kind of changing in how rewarding it is. So if it's incredibly sparse, would you still expect to see this kind of clustering happen? Or if there are these patch types which are kind of more of a continuum rather than these clearly defined patch types, what would you expect to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Nora actually did some work, which is also in the paper, looking at how this model performs in a single patch environment, which is just, has a wider variance, right? And this is actually kind of part of the suggestion that we made in this paper and in a couple of conference papers previously, which is that maybe this observation of over-harvesting has to do with the fact that people are just slicing up unimodal environments, whether they're highly variable or not very variable, into multiple modes based on the variability that they've observed. This predicts order effects. It predicts greater effects at higher variability. Love to reanalyze existing data in the types of tasks that you're talking about and really dig into this a bunch more and see how it interacts with the uncertainty adaptive discounting. I think you point to a great set of experiments that should happen moving forward. But the suggestion is that people may have an inductive bias towards multimodality, even in ostensibly unimodal environments or even in continuously varying environments.
Okay, yeah, that's really cool. And I guess another question I had following on, you mentioned about order effects. So I'm curious about if, someone's moving from an environment with almost no structure to one with, a few clusters, what kind of order effects would you kind of expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that depends in part on the variability of the initial cluster, right? So if the variability is high, they might be, they might have inferred multiple clusters, and that might actually help them be more adaptive. It's a really good in the second portion of the task. It's a really good question, and it's certainly one worth investigating empirically.
Okay, cool, great. So no other questions from me, although we've just had one from Rory. So he says, great talk, a technical clarification for the quick study. Did I understand correctly that the subjects of the test were children and the quick survey was carried out retroactively sometime after the event? And can you elaborate on the time points of that study, please?
Yeah, so the data that I presented that had the quick with it was from the published study, which is all in adults, all people over 18, and was collected online. The average age in that study was in their 30s, and the quick is measured retrospectively. It asks a bunch of questions about your life before age 12 and before age 18. That having been said, in partnership with the Connie Center, they are doing a prospective cohort study where they've been following some people even prenatally, and they measure directly using coded videos of interactions between an infant and their primary caregiver, sequences, the predictability of sequences of sensory interactions between the primary caregiver and the infant, like looking directly in their eyes, touching their face, that sort of thing. And I watched these videos back to back, and I cannot tell the difference. But Hal Stern, who's a really amazing statistician, developed a measure to quantify the predictability of these transitions into something called the entropy rate, and it turns out to be remarkably predictive of later outcomes, even in this prospectively followed cohort, and seems to correspond with the sorts of things that are measured retrospectively by the quick as well. So, this is something we'd like to do in the future. Obviously, it's prospectively followed cohort. It's going to take years to actually cash out, but that's something we want to look at.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Very cool. And we have a question from Alex Kosalnik. So could overharvesting be due to the fact that overstaying is less costly than understating by the same time? This is the case in most MVT scenarios.
Yeah, so we designed the task such that structural learning was actually not incentivized. And so does overstaying become less costly than understaying in that environment? I'm not sure. I think they should be equated in this environment, but I would have to go back and check to be sure. It's a great question, of course, from Dr. Kosalnik.
Great. And a follow-up to this from Ibo. So could the cost of understanding be correlated with the level of uncertainty or variance in a certain cluster?
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, and that's something that we should investigate in simulation and in experiment as well.
Great, lovely. So thanks very much for that. We'll invite everyone now back and we can have a bit more of a general chat about some of these bigger questions. So let me invite everyone back.
Nora might have better answers to some of the questions that were asked, so let's give her the chance first.
Great, don't forget Matt. I'll just give Matt a few seconds to join. So in the meantime, we have a tradition that the guest panelist gets to ask the first question. So Nora, I don't know if you want to go ahead, although we're still waiting on Matt. Let me just check. He's all okay.
Yeah, let's give a second for him to join because my question is motivated by the work he presented.
Lovely. Let me try him again. I think he's having some connection issues. There we go. Cool. Hey, Matt.
Yeah, so my question is motivated by the work that you presented, Matt. I'm kind of curious to hear from both Matt and Aaron their thoughts on this. So in social relationships, we can reciprocally shape each other's behavior. So we might choose how we interact with someone as sort of a teaching signal to shape how they interact with us in the future. But in the patch leaving tasks you guys both presented, we often tell participants, like, you're only going to visit this patch once and never return to it, breaking this relationship. So I was wondering, how could the strategies we develop in naturalistic environments in which we can often return to patches carry over to these tasks where we tell people that they can't? This seems like it would make the planning problem a lot more complex. And could this relationship change depending on the types of resources you're foraging for, so social or non-social?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I mean, I guess our reason for doing that fairness study was because I think pretty much all of social psychology and social neuroscience is always looking at how we interact with other people and not how we choose not to, if that makes sense. So that was the inspiration behind it, as well. Let's start by stripping out the fact that you can't do anything about how another person's interacting with you and how would you react to that. And I think it's important because I think there are situations where we can't always influence other people, or there are one-sided relationships, or there are situations where it absolutely makes sense. For instance, if you're at a party and your boss is not treating you very well, it might be advisable not to argue with them and maybe just go and talk to someone else. So there are situations where I think this decision-making mechanism on its own might be being used. But for sure, I think that most social interactions are going to involve something much more complex. Whether this is also going on under the hood, right? So you're also thinking about, well, what are the alternatives, right? So maybe you are in a debate with a friend and they're frustrating you. So you still think, even though I've tried to diffuse this situation or I've tried to move the topic of conversation on, there still might be somebody better for me to go and interact with, or there isn't somebody better to interact with, and how that influences these decisions might well come into play. But yeah, I think certainly, like, for sure, social cognition is more complex than this version of the experiment.
Great, thanks, Matt. Sorry, Rory, did you want to come in?
I could, yeah, unless you had something to specifically add to that. I had my
No, I was going to pivot to something else, but
okay. Mine's quite well. Okay, I have a couple, but I was wondering, but for both of you, really, I don't know so much about this like foraging task applied to humans, really, but and I think especially Matthew, you touched on it a bit, looking at like dopamine dysregulation and that kind of thing. And I was wondering if what you guys could tell me about whether these kind of tasks have been applied to human cognition in terms of like psychiatric disorders, and how I'd be really interested to know how these kind of decision-making dynamics are shifted when in these kind of disorders. Do you have much information on that, or if you specifically looked at it? I don't know.
Do you want to go, Aaron, or shall I?
You can go first. All I have to say is that yes, we're totally interested in investigating that. We have not done so.
Right. Yeah, same. So we haven't done a huge amount of stuff that we've published yet, but we did in the fairness study, as I said, we found relationship with loneliness, which is strongly associated with depression. Like I think depression and loneliness are like 0.7 correlated. I think there's a lot more work to be done, right? As in, I think if you compare how many times a reinforcement learning task has been done related to a psychiatric condition versus a foraging task, then it's probably about 1 million to 1. So there's ample opportunity to ask questions. I don't know of a huge amount of data. I mean, there are individual studies, but I wouldn't say there's like a huge body of evidence yet of how particular features of foraging decisions might map onto different psychiatric traits or anything like that. And likewise, there is work looking at different neuromodulators. So I think there's some work on neurogenergic mechanisms and how they relate. There's a little bit of work on dopaminergic mechanisms, including some of our work. But yeah, there's a lot to be done. Basically, there's many future studies to be done.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I think that I can say something maybe a little bit more substantive than what I did, which is that, you know, the ship that's the insight that sort of launched 1,000 ships in the human cognitive neuroscience was this idea that maybe this is a more ecologically valid task. And I think, you know, that is still an open question, especially when we're talking about doing this on a computer screen in a laboratory over a web browser. But I will say that Nora's approach here of sort of taking these sort of proven optimal learning and planning mechanisms and then modeling them and decomposing choices into them and then looking for individual differences and parameters that we can root in these sort of normative approaches may have some validity for, you know, what NIMH is calling computational phenotyping. And that's sort of the thing that that's going to be a working hypothesis for a lot of studies moving forward, at least in my lab. And I know I've seen it presentations in several other labs as well, doing this sort of thing as well.
Thanks. That's really interesting stuff. Thanks. Exciting.
Yeah, it's really cool. I guess maybe a follow-on from that is, you know, thinking about, both of you have mentioned slightly about the neural mechanisms underlying this kind of behavior. So Matt, you were talking a bit about like dopamine and other neuromodulators, and Aaron, you were talking a bit about like the role of the OFC, for example, in planning. And I don't know if either of you want to kind of expand on that. You know, Aaron, what role do you think dopamine might have in structural learning and uncertainty adaptation, and vice versa for Matt?
I'm going to politely decline on that one. There's just so much to say about what dopamine does and does not do. And I think, you know, this year we're experiencing in particular a miraculous year for dopamine, right? We've had 3 or 4 papers that have directly challenged the RPE hypothesis quite substantively. And in particular, I want to point out, you know, I think the science paper everyone's probably aware of, focusing on the role of causal explanations or causal links in explaining the dopamine signal. And this is something that is very, very much of interest to us and very much related to the sort of work that Nora has done and the sort of work we'd like to look at forward, because it really centers the role of memory and the organization and structure of memory in understanding the dopamine signal. So I think there's a lot to come there. And I think what I take from this is that a lot of what is going on in maybe I'll be a little provocative here. I think a lot of what's going on in the dopamine signal that people are observing in various tasks is actually downstream of the individual differences that are actually driving the effects of interest. And so I think moving into examining the upstream causes of this dopamine firing is going to be really important moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Aaron and I's answer about what does dopamine do may have been different last year than now. So it's in terms of the reciprocal of whether planning is involved. I mean, I think it would be interesting in a lot of these social tasks. I think that's what Nora was kind of getting at, is like, to what extent can you plan and navigate? Like, how do you find a way to interact with the person that you want to, right? And certainly, I mean, in the studies that have looked at sort of economic games looking at fairness, I don't think there's much evidence of orbitofrontal cortex planning mechanisms being involved in that. It seems to be other systems that are involved in calculating fairness, but they're all pretty rudimentary, right? You're not navigating a world to try and find the fair person you want to interact with. And I think certainly in situations like that, you would expect other prefrontal mechanisms to be involved.
Great, lovely, thank you. It wouldn't be a foraging seminar without a bit of controversy. So,
I have a naive question. So, how generalizable the belief about the statistics of the environment? Let's say I go to Aaron's lab, take the space test, and I come up with a certain probability of transition, certain just rate of rewards. And I go to Matt's lab and I take the MIP test. So how the space test would affect the MIP test, and how, so in how much time it decays, or whether it is even stored.
I'll offer a speculation. So you asked something that is absolutely something we want to do, right? Which is about really the stability of these parameters, right? I didn't show you test-retests within the same subject. And our suggestion is that, these parameters are rationalizable on the basis of people's experience, both within the task and also across their lifespan. But they could also be influenced by many factors that happened that day to them, or within the past week. And so we really want to understand the stability of these parameters and what else might be informing them across time, across contexts, across labs, across continents that you might be taking these experiments on, so on and so forth. And I think it's there are many fruitful routes for doing so. I would not expect the exact same estimation between two runs of the same task, even if within the same lab, let alone different tasks in different labs. Not just yet, anyway. I think we would need to take account of a lot more information in order to do that.
Yeah, I guess the idea behind the work Aaron's doing with the computational work, and this is some of the work that we're doing in my lab as well, is potentially there are stable mechanisms, right, that you deploy for different types of tasks. And so therefore, if that is true, then you would hope that although the parameter number might be different between his task and my task, the people who score a high parameter on his task will also end up having a high parameter on mine, right? So then it's some characteristics that, yeah, sure. We'll do that one day. The interesting thing in terms of, I guess, the broader question is how much do stable characteristics actually feed into this behavior? And this is absolutely anecdotal, but provides pretty compelling evidence to me that the fairness experiment that we tested 5 participants to start it off, and we nearly junked the experiment because none of them left. And then we realized it's because the first place it got posted was an economics undergraduate course, and they all came in and their answer was, well, why would you ever leave? You're earning money. And so there are some properties of individuals that are stable across characteristics. So then we tested some non-economics people, and that's where the behavior became a bit more variable.
Thank you.
That's can't beat that anecdote. That's fantastic.
But also, just a follow up to that question in general. Similarly, I wonder how these things might repeatable within an individual as well. But I wonder also like across generations, like if suites of characteristics that we see might be heritable would be like also very interesting, but maybe hard to test. You extract from environment and everything. I have one more question. I don't know if anyone else has another question.
No, I think we'll need to wrap up soon.
Yeah,
needs to get off.
Okay.
But if it's a quick one, then go for it.
Yeah, it is a quick one. I think it's possibly more of a yes or no answer. It's another naive question, really. But I was wondering. I mean, as I said, I'm not so experienced with human studies, but I work on animals, obviously. With animals, obviously, we have experiments kind of in the lab and in the field, and I see your guys' experiments as fairly kind of lab-based human experiments. I was wondering if there are examples of people actually studying human foraging in the field in terms of actually like either something that's kind of a naturalistic experiment that has been set up, or as far as doing real field work with like hunter-gatherer style, like real foragers in the wild. And are those studies out there, and do you can you use this information when guiding your own research?
The answer is yes to both of your questions, but no, we haven't done it yet. Like I said, this is our first foray into foraging, but what you point out is absolutely something I would love to do in collaboration with anthropologists and field workers. Yeah, once we sort of firm up our lab work a little bit more, I think.
Originally, sorry.
Okay.
You go. Thanks. Originally for the kids study, we had wanted to do something a little bit more naturalistic where we were going to have them dig through ball pits for snacks, and we would have them come in before lunch, but we decided that it might be a little too cruel for the research assistants having to run that to deal with food deprived children.
It was also a pre-COVID idea.
There's a bar local to us that has a massive bull pit. So maybe there's a industry collaboration going on there. Just to follow up, so there's lots of work looking at nomadic tribes and the extent to which they conform to like MVT predictions. And I mean, as difficult as that data is to collect, there's evidence that seems to support the idea, right, that human tribal type behaviors, and when they decide to move locations to forage for food, does all sort of fit with these ideas.
Cool, thank you. I'm loving the sound of this bull pit idea. Is it just children that can take part, or can adults do too?
No, we definitely would need adult comparison group.
Great, looking forward to it. Great, we'll wrap up everything there. Thank you so much, Matt and Aaron, for joining us. That was a really interesting talks and a really great discussion at the end as well. And thank you to Nora as well for joining us, and to Rory and Ivo. So we're busy organising our next session. We'll be sharing details about that shortly, so to make sure to check out Twitter and emails as well for information on that. But thank you everyone for joining, and we'll finish there.
Thank you.